Hello fellow bike people! This time on Project Used Bikes, I'm going to talk about an award that the city gave me. Now this video is just going to be me talking, but I'm going to be presenting some hot takes later on, so stick with me. So, this is the Phil Green Award for Cycling Advocacy in Mississauga. If you're not from Mississauga, you might not know who Phil Green is, but if you are from around here, you've probably heard the name at some point. He is one of the original cycling advocates in the city. He's essentially responsible for the formation of the Cycling Advisory Committee in the first place, or he's one of the most important people responsible for setting the city on a path towards more cycling. So what I won the award for was basically what I've been doing in the Project Used Bikes series here. Now of course, the video series is just for my YouTube channel. I'm basically making it for my own entertainment. What really counted was the work with the GLE movement and Mississauga Cycles. So between the two groups, I tuned up hundreds of bikes, and we gave them to either newcomers to Canada through Mississauga Cycles or youth in Malton through the GLE movement. My contribution was fixing bikes, but really I couldn't have done it on my own. I first of all don't have the facilities and all of the tools, like a place to do the work, and the most important thing is I don't have the people skills. Now don't get me wrong, I can be friendly, but I don't have the ability to connect with people on the same way as, the people who run the programs I was working with. So I want to give a big shout out and thank you to Janice Lowe from the GLE movement, Rahul Mehta from Mississauga Cycles, Brian from Cycle Path, you all know Brian, and everybody involved with the Mississauga Cycling Advisory Committee. I love the work you folks are doing. So now the rambling starts a bit. I wouldn't have been motivated to do the work that got me this award if it wasn't for what bikes had given me personally. So I was homeschooled before high school, and bikes, the first thing they gave me was just before I started high school. I realized they gave me everything cars otherwise promised. The freedom to go where I wanted and just enjoy the world, be free to move around. But I found they were even more so. Cars, you have to follow road rules, you have to get insurance, you have to pay for gas. Bikes are just so much more simple and free in my mind. So that was the first thing bikes really gave me to help my confidence, my mental health, just make me feel good about myself. But the second thing was when I got into high school, I found it really, really hard making friends and communicating, connecting with people. Bikes, they became the ultimate tool for doing that. When I would go out on the bike and just go to a set of dirt jumps or a skate park, all of a sudden, I was just, by default, one of the cool kids. I might not have been seen that way by everybody else there, but I felt that way. That's what's important. Bikes became a lens through which I see the world and really form connections with people. That's what they do for me. And that's what I want to give back to everyone else in the community. Building a social life with bikes is honestly the easiest way to do it from what I can see, and I really love the work that both the GLE movement and Mississauga Cycles are doing to support that. But here's where the hot takes come in. Most cycling advocacy seems to be focused around bike lanes around here. And now, I hesitate to say this, but I'm not a huge fan of that idea. Hear me out. As a cyclist, yes, I want bike lanes. I want a place to ride my bike and to feel safe where I'm not going to be interrupting traffic or be in danger from traffic and also not be endangering pedestrians. Makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is for a city that has the amount of open space that Mississauga does and the amount of resistance to bike lanes from a lot of the communities around here, why are we pushing that so hard when there are alternatives? And hear me out, there are alternatives. This is The Rules by the Velominati. This is kind of a snobby, tongue-in-cheek road bike thing where they're laughing about, the rules you have to follow. Things like you would never let another cyclist run tires and seat and bar tape on the road bike that didn't match. But one of the rules that does really appeal to me is guide the uninitiated. A Velominatus should guide the uninitiated, and here's why. Experienced cyclists are very capable on their own of finding places to ride and being confident doing that. It's less experienced cyclists that really need the introduction and the boost to get started in cycling. Because in my mind, cycling is the exact opposite of the whole easy to learn, hard to master. It is pretty hard to get into it. It's hard to learn in the first place. If you don't have a background in cycling, even just being able to ride a bike, you get into it, there's just a sensory overload of information, and the amount of stuff you'll see about what clothing you should wear, what kind of bike you should have, exactly how high-end your bike should be, what you should do for maintenance, it can be really overwhelming, and having a guide will really simplify that. But, that said, the opposite side of that is once you are initiated, it's just riding a bicycle. Now that is another one of my kind of controversial opinions, because a lot of people see it as something much more complicated than just riding a bike. But in my mind, cycling's only as complicated as you choose to make it. If you want it to be super simple, you can make it super simple. If you want it to be a high-end, world-class competition level sport, you can do that as well. That's what makes cycling so beautiful, is it can be anything to anyone. So if I were to sum up my ethos of this thought with one statement, it would be bike life over bike lanes. Not specifically referring to the wheelie bike life where, you know, the ride outs and everybody having like the big BMX bikes. That's not what I'm referring to. Just bike related lifestyle over bike lanes is what we should be focusing on, because I genuinely think the mental health benefits of cycling are something that should be much more focused on than the infrastructure that we could provide for cyclists. Wait, maybe not bike life over bike lanes, maybe best life over bike lanes. That could work. Okay, so I want you to imagine a triangle. At one point, there's racing. At one point, there's commuting. And at one point, there is family cycling. So the RCF triangle, we'll call it. In an ideal world, I think in the point of that triangle, our focus on cycling will be right in the middle, perfectly balanced between all 3 points. But from what I can see, it's not perfectly balanced at the moment. It is focused much more towards the commuting and the racing side, but not so much focused towards the family side. Now, being that I think the family side is being largely ignored, I want to make a few suggestions as to how cycling advocacy groups in the city could maybe change their focus to improve cycling for more people. So the first we're going to address, obviously, bike lanes. Now let's talk about bike lanes on Bloor. That is a movement that started a long time ago in Toronto, and in Toronto I feel like that is a genuinely important movement because Toronto is a city that needs cycling much more than Mississauga does for commuting. So if you think about Bloor Street in Toronto, it is extremely densely packed for the most part, and there's no alternative ways. It is the major artery through that part of the city. Now, bike lanes in a city that densely packed where it is so difficult to drive make a ton of sense. However, if you think about Bloor in Mississauga, that is a much more open area. There's a lot more open grass space, there's parkland, there is, you know, separate bike paths that cross Bloor at a few points to my knowledge. And the community seems to be resistant to adding bike lanes to Bloor Street in that main artery. Now, if they are so resistant, why would we force that on them when we could otherwise, say, use the vast amounts of grass and park space in Mississauga to add bike lanes or other routes there? So the first option would be allow bikes on sidewalks in some situations. Now, in Mississauga, we have bylaws that basically say you have to be a kid to ride a bike on a sidewalk. Now that does make sense, especially for some of the, more busy areas of the sidewalks in the city, like in the downtown core. But for some of the areas further out where the sidewalks are fairly empty and there's a lot of space, I think it would make sense to connect some of the parkland and the existing bike paths, not by adding more bike lanes, but by allowing cyclists on the sidewalks in those areas with very clear signage that cyclists have to yield to pedestrians, ride slowly, or whatever the case may be, as whoever makes these decisions sees fit. But adequate safety signage and whatever the relevant rules are and bylaws being changed. I think that's the first alternative. Now the second, this is another one of those weird city bylaws things, but a lot of big streets in Mississauga will have, 2 or 4 lanes of traffic, a large grass area with a small concrete barrier, and then the sidewalks kind of raised up over the level of the rest of the street. I'm sure there is a reason that we have all that grass space in between the sidewalk and the road. I'm assuming it's a city bylaw, I'm not actually sure, but I think it would make a lot of sense to take some of that space, and especially the ones that have fairly wide concrete dividers between the road and the grass space, add bike lanes there. You can add bike lanes without changing the actual roads themselves so that the drivers don't feel like their lives are being interrupted, but we as cyclists still get our bike lanes. Continuing with that thought of connecting different parts of the cycling infrastructure that already exist in the city, we have bike racks on our buses, but those bike racks are old. They fit really skinny wheels. Now, even when I was a teenager and I rode BMX, and they first put the bike racks on the buses, I found quite frequently my tires were too wide to fit into them, so I would have to let some air out and then force the bike rack over the tire. And it's a lot of effort. Then I would have to pump up my tire before I could actually ride the bike. And I know for a fact that is still an issue because Tony lives in Malton. He works at Cycle Path. We're down in Arundel. That is quite a distance. He's literally on the other side of the airport. So a lot of the time he does have to take the bus down here, and he'll show up at the shop with his tire mostly deflated because it physically will not fit into the bike rack. And wheelie bikes and BMX bikes are not the only bikes that have this problem. This is pretty much universal. All bikes these days have wider tires than the same category of bike did even 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, fat bikes exist with tires this wide. How is somebody supposed to take that on the bus? So I think different styles of bike racks may be worth looking into, or more open policies involving bringing bikes onto the bus. I think there is definitely options to look into for that, or things like incentivizing cyclists to use the bus by offering a discount for somebody using a bike or something like that. And now my last little gripe about bike lanes here. Why are they just bike lanes? Why do we call them that when bikes are definitely not the only vehicles that could make use of them? Now, Phil Green, when I received the award, he made a little speech and he brought this up, it's not just about bicycles. If you're trying to make a city friendly for transportation, easy to get around, bikes are a great option, but they're definitely not the only option. So the obvious thing that pops up is whether or not e-bikes should be allowed in bike lanes, and I think of course, why not? As long as they're limited to 32 kilometers an hour, which is what the Class 1 rules for e-bikes are anyways, that seems perfectly safe. That's a totally reasonable speed that your average cyclist can reach on their own. It's not excessive. That seems totally normal. I have no idea why anyone wouldn't want bikes like that in the bike lanes. Or if they're motorcycle fast, I can understand why you wouldn't want them there, but most e-bikes are not. Another thing, electric scooters. Again, if they're limited to 32, they are roughly the same weight as a bike, take up roughly the same space on the road as a bike. What's the harm? Just let them in the bike lanes too, because, you know, it's a lane for vehicles that are personal transportation that are not cars. So, yeah, let electric scooters there. Bigger vehicles like electric wheelchairs, for example, or four-wheeled bicycle or e-bike alternatives for people with disabilities, because those exist. Of course, those should be allowed in bike lanes as well. Rollerblades, skateboards, longboards? Yeah, do it. I think bike lanes shouldn't just be seen as lanes for bicycles. I think in the interest of making them more accessible to more of the community, I think they should be about any kind of transportation that is not a licensed road vehicle and is not pedestrian walking. I think everything in the middle should go right in there. Now here's my last big suggestion. This one goes out to not just, the Cycling Advisory Committee, the City Council, all the, groups that may do cycling advocacy here or anywhere else, but this also goes out to schools. Now in high school, we had transportation technology, which we all referred to as auto shop. Now, we learned about cars 90% of it, and we did a small brief unit covering trains and other kinds of transportation, but it was cursory overlook at best. I don't think that's right. I think, yes, people need to know about cars, but I think they also need to know about other forms of transportation, and things like how to repair a bicycle, how to use a bicycle safely, or what safe bike alternatives are, like electric bikes and electric scooters, how to use an airport, even how to use a train network. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But where I'm going with this is to make cycling more accessible and personal transportation. I think there should be a greater focus on education about not just how to ride a bike safely, but also how to maintain a bike. Because from my experience, most cycling injuries don't happen because somebody was hit by a car and it was the driver's fault or it was the cyclist's fault. They happen because an emergency situation occurred and the bike was not safe enough to carry them through that emergency situation safely. Things like loose brakes, loose bearings, warped wheels, soft tires. All these things can make a difference, and if people aren't aware of them, they have no incentive or reason to fix them in the first place, and I think that's where a lot of safety hazards come from. So, especially at a younger age, I think it would be good to educate people in bike safety basics or personal transportation safety basics, because the whole premise of, say, bearings and wheels still applies to scooters. Your average kid's scooter, I mean, I know the one I rode when I was a kid was super unsafe because I ruined it and I had no idea how to fix it. So I think that's just a good basis of education that people need. So pamphlets, short courses, events, like the school play days at the end of the year. I remember we had those in high school, and I would have loved for bikes to be involved in those, like a bike rodeo or something like that, even as like a high school student, someone who would otherwise have been too old for a bike rodeo as they do for kids. I think an adapted version of that would have been amazing. So I think just getting bikes more saturated in people's lives and get them comfortable with them being there, I think that's just as important to helping people's mental health and getting them on bikes as anything else. Something that I really like that Mississauga has is slow roll groups. Now, this is just groups of people who go for slow-paced, casual bike rides just to explore the city together. You get seniors, you get younger people, you get students, you get hardcore athletes, you get basically the whole variety of people that live in the city, and it's just a wonderful experience. I think it would be great for schools to run something similar for their students, or to make those groups more well-known within the city. Now, the last thing I want to address here, and then I'll let you go soon, is space for people to have bike events, because that is a bigger issue than a lot of people actually realize. So, when I work with Mississauga Cycles, they're hosted out of Peel Multicultural Council. Amazing place, but they themselves use rented space from the bottom of, I believe it's a church or a school or something like that. But either way, there's not much space to store bicycles or do bicycle repairs. So I know Raul was looking into getting just a storage container or a shipping container to leave in the parking lot to, effectively store and work on bikes. But I think it kind of sucks that he has to go that far. And the similar situation with the GLE movement. Janice, her backyard and her minivan got absolutely trashed just storing the hordes of bikes that we had to work on. I feel like being that what we do is clearly appreciated, because not only did I win the Phil Green Award from 2021, Janice won it from 2020. So clearly what we're doing is being noticed and it's being appreciated. I think it would be greatly advantageous if space in community centers were dedicated to these groups and cycling advocacy in general. Like the Malton Community Center, I know the GLE movement already hosts a lot of events and rides out of there, so I think it would be great to see one room there being given to Janice or the GLE movement as dedicated space. Similar situation with Mississauga Cycles. They're in Meadowvale in relatively close proximity to like the Meadowvale Community Center around Lake Aquitaine. That's a beautiful facility, and it's honestly, in my opinion, one of the best places for casual cycling and learning to ride a bike in the city, because it's a short 5-minute loop around a beautiful lake. I think if Mississauga Cycles could get a room there that's just dedicated space for them to run their programs, that would be hugely advantageous, and I think that would go a long way to, again, helping people's mental health and getting people on bikes in the city. So, my big conclusion from all of that is, obviously, I like the idea of bike lanes. I just want to see some alternatives being looked into from everybody who's involved in bikes around the city. And again, I want to give a big thank you to Janice from the GLE movement, Rahul from Mississauga Cycles, and Brian from Cycle Path, because without you, I would not have been able to do any of what I did. Thank you all.